All right. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started if you want to take your seats. My name is Whitney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library. Just wanting to welcome you here to this wonderful program. This is in partnership with the Decorative Arts Center of Ohio in Lancaster. This is in honor of their current exhibition, MOD, Visual Social Cultural Renaissance of the 1960s, which is on display until August 25th. So they are our neighbors just down 33. If you want to go check that out, it's all about the 1960s. And I want to thank the Decorative Arts Center. The director, Jason Craybill, is in the audience. And I want to thank Judy Oppenheimer, the External Relations Manager, for coordinating this program. She reached out to us about it. So thank you. And please take a look at our upcoming programs in our program guide. We have the history of the development of Main Street coming up on Thursday, which is Bexley, in honor of Bexley Day. And then we have a month-long celebration of James Baldwin. And now I have a few words about our speaker. David Steigerwald is a professor of history at Ohio State University, where he directs the History Department's World War II program and has taught undergraduate courses in the 60s for 3 decades. Among his books are The 60s and the End of Modern America and Debating the Sixties, Liberal, Conservative, and Radical Perspectives, co-authored with Bexley's own Michael Flamm. He is finishing a book on alienation in post-war World War II America, a central socio-cultural element in the creation of the 60s. With this talk, he is launching on a new project on Robert Kennedy and America at a vital crossroads. So please welcome David Steigerwald.
Thank you, everyone. Is the mic working okay, Whitney? Well, we're good to go then. I really appreciate everyone coming out on a Sunday afternoon, even interrupting the Guardians game to do that. That's flattering. Let me express my appreciation to Judith Oppenheimer, who instigated all this. She's a remarkable cultural entrepreneur. And she emailed me maybe late March, Judith, and said that you were doing something on the 60s. Do I know anybody who has something worthwhile to say about it? And I had just returned from the Kennedy Library, where I had taken my first plunge into material that I'm going to use to talk today. And so I took the opportunity to say, oh yeah, but we're going to have to talk about something pretty specific. So we arm wrestled and got to the point where we agreed I'd talk a little generally and then a little specifically about the project I have in mind, such as I do at this point. So thank you, Judith. I appreciate it. Make sure you think about going down to Lancaster to see the show before it ends. I'm going to stay here a second. I also really appreciate the opportunity to be here in Bexley. This is an amazing public institution. And one of the many things they do so well here is bring the community authors who are here to speak about new books and new ideas. That's not exactly what I'm here to do today. This is a not yet book talk. As many of my colleagues can tell you, Mike Flamm most probably uppermost among them, I've had in mind a book on the Kennedy funeral for a long time. And I've just kind of been collecting material by and by as comes in front of me while I worked on this much larger, more abstract project. One of the things I liked about it was, first, that it was a very compact story, one that was inviting to straightforward narrative history, but at the same time had a lot of edges of ambiguity that offer opportunities for thinking broadly about all kinds of public matters, historical and otherwise. I'm always interested in how the things we look at tell us something about the human condition at its most basic. And I was hoping that this one would. So this is the first time I've tried out any ideas at all. I mean, this is a complete rough draft of a rough draft that I haven't rough drafted yet. So it's a not yet book, but if this really goes sideways, I guess it's could be not going to be a book talk. So we'll just see how it goes. And I'm really anxious to get feedback. And so to get to that point, let me move on here and try to explain where my head is at this point. As I do, let me explain to you what finally has gotten me to this point. One is making good progress on the larger project, but the other is the availability of a collection of oral histories that were taken by a woman named Jean Stein Vanden Heuvel, who was a kind of Kennedy insider. Her husband, William, was very close to the Kennedys, to Bobby and Ethel. And she did over 300 oral histories immediately after the funeral, and in moments that were still very cuttingly close. I mean, some of the interviews were done just a week after the funeral, then throughout the summer. Very few of them were 1969 and 1970. Most of them were really, really fresh. And I don't know exactly how to take that. You historians out there can give me some good advice on that, but it presents both a problem and a kind of interesting element to it. But the thing is, the collection was donated in 2018 after Stein's death, suicide actually, and then the pandemic shut it down. So I'm really kind of the first person to go through it, and that's always fun as a historian. It's like finding a potential holy grail. I've been through about a third of it, and so again, that gives you an idea of how unformed and how unfinished this project is. And this is another way of my begging for patience. But there's a lot there. Nothing that I've seen so far is mind-blowing. None of it is going to change the course of the way we think about the politics of 1968 or the Kennedys' place in it. What it does do is provide an enormous depth to a very concentrated moment in time among a pretty select group of people. It was a pretty huge one as funerals go, but they were a pretty select group. And I'm finding it really interesting in that way. So what you're going to get is mostly drawn from very, very fresh archival material. Pictures not so much, because they haven't really done much with the pictures in that collection yet. I've got an order for a few to be digitized. It'll be another 6 months before the OSU bookkeeper makes that happen, no doubt. But in any event, there you go. So, one question, I guess, off the top is, why do we need another Kennedy book? There's a dozen of them back there already. And the answer is, yeah, I kind of get that. Though I know of 3 different Kennedy biographies, John, of various sorts that are in the works now, at least one by a really eminent historian, Frederick Lageville from Harvard. And I'm reading reviews of the latest salacious book on the Kennedy men, a book I probably will not read, the reviews having disabused me of any interest in it. But there you go. The editor's or publisher's answer to that question is the Kennedys sell. That's not my interest, really. Mine is the historian's. And so what kind of question can the historian ask here? I mean, if you're going to do a book, you ought to have a good question going in. I like to say that the art of writing history is connecting 2 random points in time with some kind of squiggly line. And so you still have to do that with some kind of question in mind. And in this case, and this is what is going to make this project difficult, the question to ask is so obvious, so inescapable, and yet so unanswerable. And that is, what if? You'll see in the material I present you today that many of the people on that train, at the funeral, around the Kennedys were asking that question to themselves and to one another. It was omnipresent in their consciousness as they went through this experience. But historians don't do counterfactuals. I mean, they do, but I don't find them very interesting. I call them coffee and beer questions, depending on what time of day you're talking. They're just things to kick around. But I can't escape it. So there's going to be some of this here as we go. And again, I'm just laying it out, and we'll see where that squiggly line takes us today. Fair enough? Now, I promised Judith that I would talk some about the 60s. So we need to start that way. It's easy to find juxtapositions to try to illustrate the extraordinary tumult and patterns of change that took place roughly in that decade, though it's always hard to know when the 60s started and when they ended, if they have. But let's do it this way. Let's look at this. This is a picture from Barnard, a co-ed, and only women were called co-eds, of course, and they weren't because they were at a woman's college, so they weren't technically co-eds unless they were going across the street, as many of them started to do, to take classes at Columbia. But in any event, they still had to sign out in order to go out on dates, to do any number of other things. In other words, Barnard, like most universities in 1961, was still under the old regime of in loco parentis, as they called it. 1961. Well, wrong way. 1970. Something's changed. If you look at that long enough, you'll notice that that is the OSU Oval. And that is an OSU. I don't think she'd appreciate anybody calling her a co-ed. So what happened here? What makes the 60s of enduring interest and a great area of study is that it was a really unique moment of the intersection, or the collision might be a better word, of some immense public issues. You know what they were: the Black liberation struggle and the Vietnam War. But those emerged with such power and defining ability at the time when vast structural changes in American life were underway. There was the issue of automation, after all, that was leading the country into a post-industrial setting. Now, through most of the 60s, it wasn't the case that the plants were shutting down in Ohio. That was a decade or so away, but the manufacturers stopped hiring at the floor level. And indeed, through 1950, not a single net production job was added. That sounds impossible, but that's the fact. And of course, that rattled the blue-collar, working-class people in American cities, white and black, and Chicano, and threw down a really important series of problems for policymakers: what to do with unemployment, among other things, the necessity of increasing education, because essentially all the new white-collar jobs were going to demand as much. At the same time, America was suburbanizing, and what that entailed was not only the movement out into segregated areas, and indeed by 1970, America was more segregated than it was in 1950. At least American cities were, metropolitan areas were. And that entailed also the urban crisis, the draining of tax money, among other things, away from the city cores, and it created a crisis quite of its own. And then all of this really came within the emergence of what just about every observer of the broad American scene would have told you in 1960 was the emergence of the affluent society, of a breathtaking, unprecedented breadth of affluence, of material well-being in a society that really, literally knew no like. One of the things that was really important about this is that it came at a time among a generation of adults, 30-ish, 40-ish, who had lived through a pretty miserable 15 years, the Depression and a cataclysmic World War. I'm talking about my parents. And those were rough years. The country then slid out of them into really fairly quickly, in the broader scheme of things, unprecedented material well-being. That was jarring. As Emil Durkheim taught us long ago, affluence can be just as destabilizing as poverty, sometimes more so. And that did shake up American society. Among other things, it threw down challenges. It changed the way Americans were setting their norms. Their norms about everything began to change. And they did so, as was widely noted, very often on a generational basis. As young people raised to the television and to popular music and various other accoutrements of the affluent society, provided a different way of understanding their relations to the productive world and to one another than their parents could quite understand. And what's really hard to get at, and for that reason most fascinating, is that the parents of many 18-year-olds in 1965 kind of got it. You know, they weren't nose to the grindstone people anymore either so much. Some of the old habits sure still were there, but it was clear that the hold of the old Protestant ethic, work, 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 save, 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 was dissipating. And the new norms were really quite a challenge. Now, they expressed themselves in generational terms, but again, the tricky thing for me is that those lines were hard to draw. And when you're talking about broad changes like this, you can always find exceptions, areas that weren't becoming affluent. Certainly that was true in the rural South and indeed rural America generally. Many other places, obviously the inner city. But nonetheless, the changes were there. Now, the challenge from younger folks to the establishment, you remember that word? That ubiquitous insult to anybody over 30, I guess. The challenge was really to the structure of society that Paul Goodman called the organized society. What he meant was the centralized bureaucratic world that had set in place after World War II, the large-scale corporations, connected to the growing federal government, and connected even to the university, those increasingly enlarged, metastasizing institutions into which more and more and more young people were being pulled. 2 million college students in 1960 turned into 8.5 million by 1970. And institutions like the Ohio State University back then, saw a lot of that growth directly, as Bill Shakurti, who's here, will attest. The general notion was to resist the organized society by demanding room for oneself. I think of it as a demand for autonomy. Remember that young lady who had to sign out to go on a date in New York City? Did she really want to do that? Was that not a deprivation of her rights as a human being? That she couldn't just walk away? Indeed, Tom Hayden, the famous radical, liked to put it this way, that college students, aside from prisoners, have the fewest constitutional rights of anybody in American society. And if you wrap your mind around that, he's actually right about that, given the constraints of in loco parentis. Now, this was not just a U.S. thing, and this is one of the elements that really tells us that broad structural systemic change was underway. The 60s was global. And indeed, most of the really hot writing these days in the area deal with the global nature of the revolts. I think I got another photo in there. It doesn't matter whether you look at Paris, which is this one. There's got to be a there. That's Danny the Red, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, author of Communism is Obsolete, among other things. I love that picture because he's just really mocking that burly-looking policeman that looked like he's going to club him. The campus revolts that shook the United States, shook Paris as well, almost brought de Gaulle down. Over on the right, that's the Prague Spring, the same kind of youth revolt and revolt of the creative classes in Czechoslovakia prompted a Warsaw Pact intervention. Those aren't Russian tanks, those are Polish, East German tanks, mostly. Down below, student riots in Tokyo. I had a Fulbright year in Japan a long time ago, even before this century, believe it or not. But the students at Todai, where the main hub of student protest was, still had the pyramid of beer cans in the hallway of the dorm. It was like a shrine to them from 1968. 68 was one of the most tumultuous years in modern Western history. 2020 might give it a run for its money, especially if you extend that year a week. But it was a crazy year, and it shook the world. What really this amounted to, when it got extended to the world, was a youth rebellion against the Cold War order, against the stodgy, freedom-denying world that one could argue was as much the United States as Czechoslovakia, if not the Soviet Union. Now, because American politics are always the last place where these kinds of changes seem to emerge, it really wasn't until '68 when, or we can see the 1968 campaign as a point in which they began to converge in national life. Certainly, the issues of race and poverty were keen. In the aftermath of the King assassination in April, remember, there were back-to-back assassinations in the United States, King on April 4th and Bobby Kennedy on June 5th. Congress did manage to pass the so-called Third Civil Rights Act, the Open Housing Act, and it looked as though for a minute the poverty programs of Lyndon Johnson might reemerge somewhat with legs, but it turned out not to be very lasting. In the midst of this, Vietnam was the key issue in national political life. And it was so particularly in the Democratic Party, where a group of generally younger activists began a Dump Johnson movement in late 1967. Albert Lowenstein and other activist operatives began to look around for someone to challenge Johnson for the 1968 nomination. Before I go on, let me just remind everybody that this was a moment when nominations actually were gotten at conventions, not in primaries. Something we're relearning, actually, as I stand here. And arguably, 1968 was the last time this happened, in part because of what happened. In any event, their first approach was to Bobby Kennedy, who begged off. I'll talk a little bit more about his thinking here in a minute. But it was Eugene McCarthy, the Minnesota senator, who took up the Dump Johnson challenge and began to run against the president, beginning at the New Hampshire primaries in early March, on an anti-Vietnam War plank. His was a fairly serious plank. As soon as he began his campaign in earnest, young people flocked to the McCarthy banner. and seemed to leave any thought of Bobby aside. And so for a period of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, the folks in the Bobby Kennedy camp were really thinking hard, going back and forth about whether he should challenge Johnson too. Many of his older advisors, people like Arthur M. Schlesinger and the Alsop brothers, recommended that he wait until 72. That would be your year, Bobby. 68 is too early, and you can't really just jump in the race at this point. Among other challenges to a successful Kennedy nomination. The story that comes through the Stein collection, I should say stories, because there's about 10 different takes on the Kennedy decision. But one of the more common threads was that, well, it was twofold, a two-part decision. First, Kennedy did not think McCarthy would make a good president. He simply thought he was not up to the job. There's a lot of things you could say to support this. I mean, in the middle of the primary season, he took off for a week, didn't tell anybody, went canoeing in Maine, right? And he was better known as a thinker, a philosopher, rather than a politician. And it's always dangerous to mix the two, I think. It was said of McCarthy in the Kennedy camp that if he got elected, the first thing he'd do is turn around and say, "Oh my God, I got to go back to the monastery." So they were dubious about his leadership qualities, and for good reason. But the other part of this was what to do about Johnson. And of course, that was more than just the elephant in the room when they talked. To take on the enormously powerful sitting president was really quite a thing to undertake. And while the feud between Bobby and Lyndon, which I won't go into, happy to answer any questions about it if I can, was still very much alive, Bobby was hesitant to go at Lyndon. So actually what, according to the Stein narratives, he did was float an idea that supposedly came from Pierre Salinger, the old press secretary of John Kennedy, that Johnson would convene an expert committee to overview all of what was going on in Vietnam and recommend decisions for the president about the path forward. Johnson actually eventually did this in the famous Wise Men's Council. But if you believe the Kennedy people, what happened is that Richard Goodwin, who was sort of between the McCarthy and Kennedy camps, let the administration know that Kennedy would not go into the race if Johnson formed this committee. And for various reasons, according to Jeff Schessel, Johnson decided he wasn't going to do that. In part, the anti-Bobby element had to have been important in his decision. But he'd also convened a commission for just about everything, so he was commissioned out at that point. In fact, the Kerner Commission had just released, or was in the process of releasing, its disturbing findings at that point, much to Johnson's embarrassment and anger. He really, really hated it. When Johnson apparently declined to form a committee, Kennedy then went into the race. Now, the McCarthy people, I'll just say this and move on, thought Bobby was being opportunist. They believed he was insincere about his positions on Vietnam. They were mad. And the two men didn't get along very well either, though they were able to speak to one another, and they did so with some regularity. But in any event, Bobby went and declared in mid-March, March 16th, and he was in the race. Now, for all of the Kennedys' glamour and so forth and political heft, you'd think they'd already have an operation ready to go, but not really. What was the next primary, since some had already been undertaken, was in Indiana. So they rushed into Indiana without really much of a ground game. And they began to poll away young volunteers from the McCarthy camp to the consternation of the McCarthy people. But otherwise, they were relying on the Kennedy mystique and the Kennedy brand, so to speak. Indiana went well for them in spite of their disorganization. And a couple of things came together for them that bear on the rest of the campaign. First of all, they talked about the Gary experience in the Stein interviews. Apparently, there was a moment where they had Richard Hatcher, the black mayor of Gary, riding around town with Bobby and a Polish boxer who sort of represented the working class Poles of that hard-nosed industrial city. And it seemed as though Bobby was bringing these two otherwise irreproachable groups together. And that convinced a lot of the people on the campaign, a lot of the insiders, that Bobby had something special going. Moreover, some of the reporters talked to some of the people they regarded as blue-collar ethnics in Gary, and they were astonished to discover that they had been thinking about voting for George Wallace. But now that Bobby's in the race, they're going to vote for Bobby. Now, that's a bit of a mystery that they kicked around until the very end, and one I suppose we could talk about afterwards. But it was clear that they were beginning to figure out that Bobby had a certain kind of magic that everyone else lacked. How to get around Indiana? Well, while they were up in the north, they decided that they were going to start running a train, and they called it the Wabash Cannonball. And this is not irrelevant to the funeral, obviously, because they found the train experience quite fun, and apparently Bobby loved the train. The other important thing, well, there are two others about Indiana. I won't belabor this, but he was there in Indianapolis speaking to a black neighborhood group when the news of King's assassination emerged, and he had to tell people in front of them that King had died. And he delivered extemporaneously a really beautiful set of remarks that calmed the crowd down. Indianapolis didn't have any riots, unlike 100 other cities in the United States. And much of that was credited to Kennedy's calming influence. Basically, let's honor nonviolence. Another weird thing that comes through in the Stein material was that a group of reporters congealed in Indiana, and they started calling themselves the Kennedy Press Corps. They spent the rest of the campaign together almost daily, much more even than with their families. There was one reporter, a young man named Joe Mobot, who they joked got so close to Kennedy that somebody had to check on him during the funeral so that they didn't bury him with him. Gallows humor, maybe, I don't know. But he won in Indiana, and that spurred the campaign. The next stops were in the West Coast. Actually, the next stop was in Nebraska. Then on to the West Coast. Oregon presented some real challenges. As Arthur Schlesinger kept telling him, Oregon is a middle-class white society. You're not going to do well there, so just figure you're going to lose. But California is the big the jewel, so that's where we want to put our energies. That's essentially how it worked out. McCarthy beat Kennedy in Oregon, though Kennedy did get some delegates there. In California, he benefited not only from his contacts with black activist groups and his appeal to black activist groups, although he had a feisty moment at San Francisco State. But he benefited enormously from having spent time in Delano, California during the grape strikes of 1966. And he was the only national politician to show up to support the farm workers. When he went back then, in the 68 primary, he could rely on Cesar Chavez to mobilize Mexican Americans. This also helped mobilize labor support. Walter Reuther, he hadn't quite decided, but he liked Bobby quite a lot. And Kennedy's performance in California brought Reuther and the UAW to his side, as Reuther makes clear in the Stein interview that he did. There's a funny story about the night of the victory. Chavez went out and hired a marimba band to go into the hotel, but he figured the Kennedys were going to pay for it. So they showed up and nobody was paying them to play. And so there's this scurrying around among the campaign insiders to figure out how to pay Cesar's people. They did, apparently, and the band came in. I'm not going to indulge the murder or the assassin himself, and I'm not really interested in doing this in the writing. It's something that I can see skipping by very, very quickly. I'm just not interested in that part of it. He was shot, though, just on the other side at midnight, June 5th, at the podium, or in the Ambassador Hotel after coming down from the podium. For the next 26 hours, Frank Mankiewicz, his press secretary, held forth in front of the national, indeed international press with regular reports. Mankiewicz became a kind of familiar face to Americans who were glued to their television screens until he finally came out on the 6th and announced that the senator had passed away. So the next question for the family was obvious. What do we do now? The decision was easy to make, I think, to go back to New York. Though they had flirted some with going to D.C. directly. One of the decisions they made almost right away is that this was not going to be a military-style funeral. They wouldn't have that. And they wouldn't have the pomp and circumstance of a military funeral exactly. So that recommended that they went to St. Pat's in Manhattan rather than any place in Washington, though they also had hoped that they could clear away his burial at Arlington next to his brother. That's a story here I'll get to in a minute. What an enormously difficult logistics job it was to just have a funeral at St. Pat's within about a day and a half notice. They sat down first in LA and then they flew back together. There was about 5 of them that included John Glenn. I was not aware of just how deeply embedded in the Kennedy group Glenn was, but he was, in fact, they appointed him as caretaker of the children through much of the funeral. So he was sort of responsible for making sure they had the nurses and nannies, babysitters, and so forth that they required. There were 10 of them at that point, and Ethel was newly pregnant, again, with their turned out to be the 11th. So there were lots of little Kennedys to be taken care of, and I guess the astronaut got that job. Glenn sat down and they started to put together an invitation list. And they had to go through everything. The Kennedys knew a lot of people. And there were a lot of people who liked to think that they knew Kennedys. And so how do you invite so-and-so but not so-and-so, especially when you're talking about the New York jet set? How does that work? Do you begin with family and then go to friends? And then what do you do with the national leadership and international dignitaries? They had to do all that. They ended up with a list of 2,400 people to be allowed into the cathedral. Before that, however, they had him lay in state and let a mourning line come by him. They started the process about 1:30 or so on June, it would have been the 6th. And the cathedral was supposed to close at 10 o'clock. At that point, there was still a line a mile long and 8 across up Fifth Avenue. And so the cathedral stayed open until about 4:30 in the morning, hoping to accommodate, as many people as possible before everybody was just exhausted and they closed the doors. And that was that. Some 60,000 people, according to the Times, walked by the casket. All during that, it was guarded by not military, but by friends and associates. Robert McNamara did his stint. Teddy was there for the entire time, though not standing up. Even Joe, the oldest son, second oldest in the family, did his part standing guard against the casket. Clearly a moving moment. The most moving of all probably was Ted's eulogy, which was a really terrific piece of rhetoric. I have a clip of it, but it'll take too long, so given the time, I'll simply hit the high point. As he moved to his peroration, he said, almost breaking down, his voice quaking, "Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today, pray that he was to us, and what he wished for the others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" It's from Shaw, actually, that line. And then they filed out. Now, back to how you go writing a book and some of the things that authors should think about, or what I'm thinking about. Why the train? Why the famous train from New York's Penn Station to Union Station in D.C.? Trains are interesting things in American political geography and American political experience, after all. I mean, they were always integral to long-distance campaigning, the whistle-stop tours, where the candidates would get on the back and give speeches at every place they stopped. But in terms of this project, one of the things that I think is worth paying attention to is the role that trains have played in funeral rites and in public mourning. And this is something I've got to sink into and I need to think a lot about. And one of the things that I envision as at least a first chapter, the role of trains in conveying the political leaders of the United States to their final resting place. Obviously, Lincoln's was the most famous. And it was clearly the longest, I think. 1,600 miles, it certainly was the longest in duration. Stopped at 400, or went through 400 communities with 13 major stops. It took him 2 weeks to get him from Washington to Springfield. He had to dodge through Ohio, as you can see from this list, and look at how tightly they've got the itinerary, going from Cleveland to Berea to Olmsted to Columbia to Grafton, to some of these places I'm not even sure they exist anymore, do they? Rochester, it looks like they're going in a different direction. Galion, Mount Gilead, Cardington, Ashley. I don't even know if they know that Lincoln's train came through there. My wife and I know that crossing very well. Berlin, Lewis Center now. If it were going through Lewis Center today, I'd have to wait about 2 hours for the traffic before it got to Columbus. One of the things that is interesting about Lincoln's funeral train was that it was kind of a way of knitting together a nation that had been just put asunder, at least a part of it. The East to the fabled Midwest, a kind of retracing of Lincoln's own political geography. In fact, the Republican Party united those two important parts of the northern states and brought together the remnants of the old Eastern Whigs, the anti-slavery Whigs, to the Free Soilers of Illinois and Michigan. And in a sense, then, the train was reinforcing Lincoln's own political biography, his own political strength. That's just a thought. There's another element here, and that's race and trains in American life. Obviously, Lincoln fits into the great drama or trauma of American race relations and would bear mention in this subject. But Jim Crow segregation began on the railroad trains. It's where it started. The first laws actually separating race in the 1880s were local and state statutes separating the races on trains because of the intimacy of travel and the fears for white womanhood. They're integral to the story of segregation. Indeed, Plessy v. Ferguson was about trains. And so where does that fit here in this story? Is this a story of trains redeeming themselves? What about Franklin Roosevelt's funeral train? He died in Warm Springs, Georgia, at his polio spa there. And in his famous picture on the right, Graham Jackson on his accordion played one of the songs he often played to Franklin Roosevelt while they were there. That's on the steps of the hospital. Georgia Hall is what it was called. And you can see that they brought all the patients out when the president's hearse came by on its way to the railroad station. And if you look at the crowd here at Warm Springs, and remember this is Georgia, you can see black and white people mixing together. Obviously, it's an ephemeral thing, a momentary thing, even a flash in the pan, but it's there nonetheless. 500,000 people supposedly lined the tracks as it went to Washington, and there are a lot of pictures that seem to indicate that any kind of codes of white supremacy had broken down along the way there. And so we have Robert Kennedy's funeral train that has to also be part of this story about how trains, is there something sort of powerful about them that brings people to them? Is there something mystical about them? And I think you can easily make a case that there is in American literature and American popular culture. Is there something in them that can make them a conveyance not just of a corpse, but of a spirit? Notice that the trains went from Penn Station through, it sits the Amtrak route, through Newark, through Trenton, New Brunswick, down into northwestern Maryland to Baltimore. When it went through communities, it was going through poor neighborhoods in the same way that they never built interstates through suburbia. They built the trains through poor neighborhoods. And there was inherent contact then between Kennedy, the train anyway, and his neighbors, the people who lined the tracks. The numbers are, you can't measure these things. The numbers go from 1 to 2 million. That's kind of a big squiggly line, I know, but it's not like they had turnstiles, right? And the beauty of all this was how spontaneous it was. He managed to see the people who saw him perhaps as a last hope. Here's the train as it departed Penn Station. That's Ted, who came out often and waved to people. And once the awareness dawned on them that there were these crowds along the way, he was out quite often thanking people. The family had the last 2 cars. The body, the coffin was put up on some kind of a makeshift bier in the back car so that people could get just a fleeting glimpse of it as it came by, and they could see people standing still guard. Again, only very close friends and family back in that area. As they got rolling, over 1,000 people on the train began to have a funeral. And this is where the Stein collection is really pretty neat. She asked just about everybody about their experience on the train. First of all, it was another one of these crazy logistical problems. And indeed, when they decided on the train, it had nothing at all to do with Lincoln or Roosevelt. It was just practicality. They had 1,000 people. How are they going to get them from New York to Washington in a day? Well, fly. Tough to arrange flights. You've got a lot of things to carry. Well, it seemed like the train was a good idea. Probably, I mean, it looks like close aide John Seigenthaler broached the issue, but Seigenthaler said no, it was Salinger. Salinger said no, it was Ethel. So they agreed that they all had a hand in actually deciding to use the train as it went. And then they had to cut down that 2,400 people about in half. It's like editing a chapter. You got to be really ruthless. And they got it down to about 1,200. Even moving that group of people from the cathedral to the train station was an ordeal and made them a half hour late taking off. Once they got on the train, they found ample supplies of booze and sandwiches mostly, and above all, one another. These were people who had known each other one way or another for a very long time in many, many capacities, family, friends, fellow parishioners, of course, the political leaders of the country. The run of the security establishment was there, McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, all of the bigwig policymakers in the Johnson administration. Johnson was not. He did attend the funeral, and only there with Joseph Califano. And he was very delicate about it. He really actually tried not to be the focus of any attention at all. And where to sit, Lyndon, became something of a kind of joke among them as they were planning all of this. But in any event, some people remembered this as an Irish wake. Once it got rolling and they started going down the tracks, the drinks started flowing, the stories started going, the laughing began. Dave Powers was one of the oldest of all the Kennedy's circle, and he traced his time with them all the way back to 1946. Powers was what was known as part of the Irish Mafia. He was a ward boss in Charleston, that famously Irish Catholic working class neighborhood in the Boston area, and that's how he first got hooked up to the Kennedys. In his interview with Stein, he must have gone on 2 hours of a rip about what he called Irish wakes and the triple-deckers, because the triple-deckers were the townhouses in that neighborhood, right? They weren't side-by-side townhouses. They were upstairs things. You could get, if you were stuck in the third one, well, you have to help to get the casket up, and if you're up there, well, you drank too much and you weren't in too much of a mood to bring it back down, so you just stayed, and usually they lasted 3 or 4 days. And I wish, he said, this would just keep going on and on and on. There were others who were grief-stricken, others just stunned, others exhausted. It was as varied as any funeral that any of us have been to. But the stories are good. Powers is among them. When they came out of the tunnel under the Hudson, they immediately began to see the crowds. And they were astonished at what they saw. And this, of course, is the essence of the story. Well, what do those crowds tell us? What do they tell us about Bobby? What do they tell us about America at this moment? I'm going to show you just a run of pictures, and you'll get the point. Most of them are from New Jersey. And as I said, they're going through poor neighborhoods. And these are folks who just come out, quickly hearing about the train. There were a number of photographers on the train. Paul Fusco is one of them. And the color photos are almost all Fusco photos. As I've said, the library still hasn't really gotten to their photos from Cecil Stoughton yet. I looked at them on Thursday and hope to be getting my hands on some of them. Stoughton was the guy who took the photo on Air Force One of Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office. That famous photo in an infamous and really cruel moment. But that's another story, too. Nonetheless, he took a number of black and whites of the crowds that the library has. Fusco took really nice photos, and he understood that the thing to catch was faces. And so he got himself so he was moving along with the train, so he could do his best to capture. A lot of his photos then you'll see blurring around, but he'll get a face. And that's an interesting part of his art here. This was New Brunswick, where they waited and waited and waited. And they waited because the train stopped. The train stopped because in Elizabeth, just up the tracks, a northbound train wasn't stopped. And the crowd was so thick that it just plowed into them and killed a 62-year-old Antoinette Severino and 54-year-old John Curia. They saw the train coming, they were trying to get off the tracks, but the crowd didn't allow that. Miss Severino reportedly had her 3-year-old granddaughter in her arms, and just as the train was about to hit her and roll over her, she tossed the child out, and the child was hurt but survived. 6 others were critically injured, though recovered. They stopped the train. They bellowed at the Penn Railroad people, "You got to stop all other traffic." When Roosevelt went up and down from Washington to Warm Springs, which he did with frequency, they completely shut down the railroad all the way down there. And they didn't bother to do that in this case. Again, out of practice about these sorts of things, I suppose, but in this case with fatal circumstances. One of the things you'll see, of course, is white and black folks quite together. There are a lot of Catholic nuns. What other kind of nuns are there? There are, but as a Catholic kid, there aren't. Baseball teams, Little League kids in their uniforms. This was a Saturday after all. They probably had just played and come out. Not sure where in New Jersey this is. They aren't all identified by place, which is a little clumsy, and that's my job, right? Somebody ought to do it. But look at the way the street is stopped. People are out just watching. Geography. If America was coming apart, white and black, and urban and rural, Kennedy's train touched both of those sides. Not just white and black working class in the cities, but the transition from urban New Jersey into rural northern Maryland is really quite affecting to me. And Fusco got to me, these are some of the best pictures he's got. These ones out on the countryside. These are very easily available on the web. I'm not showing you anything you can't find in 5 minutes. I hope I will be soon, but not now. You can see people knowing where the train is going to be. This is a really amazing photo, and one of the ones I've thought a lot about. One of the things that strikes me, obviously the poverty of this family. We assume it, right? And perhaps that's not fair. But they're workers. I think we can figure that. And the other thing that strikes me, 2 things about them. The reverence, I think, is striking. Many of the others, you see people with their hands over their heart, saluting if they're veterans or policemen or legionnaires. But these folks, not associated with any officialdom, obviously, nonetheless are there. The other thing that strikes me is that it is perfectly unself-conscious. It hasn't occurred to them that someone's taken a picture for them to be looked at 70 years afterwards. And we have to wonder whether they would care. That they were there for a purpose, with a purpose, and enacting a purpose. And there's a real nobility in that, it seems to me, a simple nobility that I come to admire. There are many others at Fusco Cot that are like this that I think are really quite striking, but we'll leave you with this. Now, the historian's question, could Bobby have brought everyone together? Could he have avoided the schism that 1968 became and then America has become, with its intractable divisions of race, apparently, its sharp cleavage between rural and urban? Could this have been avoided? That's a historian's question that I'm not going to answer. Maybe you can help. What strikes me is more productive is to think about what we have in front of us, what I have my hands on. And it seems quite clear that Robert Kennedy brought together an extraordinary range of people. When he was on the train, Jack Newfield, a kind of hip reporter, he was one of the new journalists, as they called them, remembered that I found myself walking through the train, and I walked by John McCone and McGeorge Bundy. I considered these guys war criminals. And yet, there they were crying and grieving, just like me. McNamara, too, he remembered. Well, Robert Kennedy brought them together. Across the country, across the train tracks, you see white and black folks. You see people coming together. But were they really together? I don't know. That's the question. As he went along, Newfield remarked that in Baltimore, it finally hit me that one thing the train taught me is that American cities really are divided by railroad tracks. And the contrast between the white people on the one side and the black people on the other was striking. So I'm cautious about reading into Bobby's potential too much. And yet there's enough there to suggest that, yes, indeed, there were people. I'm looking at that last page. Who thought that he could? What were they thinking? Think, for example, about the people in Resurrection City. Martin Luther King's last effort, the Poor People Campaign, had taken hundreds of people to the mall area and camped out there in what they called Resurrection City, and what was to be an extended protest on the grounds of poverty. It was at this point that the train finally pulled into Union Station. I mean, they were over there, and the whole thing was coming apart when Bobby finally arrived. The train finally arrived 6 hours late, 5 hours anyway. And they had to convey it to the cemetery at Arlington. They had managed to get permission from Johnson to bury him there, though he was buried, where he was buried this night, soon after the pallbearers got the body up the hill, was a temporary spot. They had to move him, and the family paid for an I.M. Pye monument that's there now. In any event, the question was, how do you take him over there? The cortege went from Union Station. They avoided the big buildings. They went by the Justice Department to honor Bobby's time as Attorney General. But then they turned toward the mall and toward the Lincoln Memorial, where Hosea Williams, a lieutenant of Martin Luther King's and one of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, had brought most of the group there. They formed a semicircle in front of the memorial and began to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic as the hearse went slowly by, a really powerful homage to Bobby. Williams said himself that we had the feeling that he knew the poor and the deprived, the forgotten and the invisible, those on that lonely island of poverty. When Dr. King was killed, I guess we all thought that at the same time Bobby was still hope in many people's hearts. And we hoped that he would run for president. Maybe, Williams remembered, the country can find its way to redeeming itself. There were others who were similarly thinking that until Bobby was gone, there was hope. But that's a very pessimistic view. That means that moment is one of hopelessness. Again, Newfield. When I saw the black people coming to the side of the train, I couldn't help but think that that was in place for voting for president. The only point that I cried on the train was when I was standing there with Adam Walensky and Jeff Greenfield, who represented what Kennedy could have become, and to look at those black faces and to know that they were casting their vote for a coffin. And that was the most disturbing thing to me. His conclusion was not hopeful. It was profoundly pessimistic. We're the first generation that learned from experience in our innocent 20s, he said, that things were not really getting better, that we shall not overcome. We felt that we'd already glimpsed the most compassionate leaders our nation could produce, and they'd all been assassinated. And from this time forward, things would get worse. Our best political leaders were part of memory now, not hope. Thank you for your attention. I'd really look forward to your comments and questions.
So now it's question and answer. If you do have a question, I'm going to ask you to use the mic.
This may be a bit tangential to your comments, but what do you think Bobby Kennedy would have thought about his son's candidacy, RFK Jr.? Well, you have him, RFK Jr. on one hand, and the rest of the Kennedys on the other hand, denouncing him, basically.
All I can tell you is how Bob Jr. comes off in the Stein collection, because I'm limited. That's all I know about the Kennedys. He was really distraught. He couldn't help with the coffin at all. He couldn't stand guard. He was the one who kept breaking down. Yeah. So he might have been 13, 14. Joe was 16. And, you know, these things being what they are, usually those are kind of 2 years apart. Catholics have a name for that. I forget what it is. Yeah, I think that's he was you can easily forgive him for that, for goodness sakes. Yeah. That's all I got for you, Larry. I'm not going beyond that.
Great presentation, Dave.
Appreciate it.
I'm interested in two things, and I'd love to get your reaction. One is, have you considered, the funeral procession is an ancient tradition. What's interesting to me, at least, is the combination of an ancient tradition with the train element and all that the train represents in U.S. history. And so I'm wondering if you've considered that idea. And the other suggestion is, obviously, if you want to understand what the train represents, you've got to go to the blues and to country music, and you've just got to listen to all of the ways that what the train symbolizes.
Absolutely, yeah, that's really good, and enormously important, as you know, for the migration, right? So again, it's buried in the history of race in this country. To the other question, which is a little more abstract, but lovely because of it, I just started Walter LaCour. LaCour is an enormously inventive historian at Berkeley who's got an 800-page book on mourning. So I'm only in the third chapter now. Let me get through it some. And by golly, he doesn't have anything to say about trains, apparently, at least not enough to put in the index. So I've got to go all the way through it. I am thinking along those lines, Michael. So it's there. Thanks.
Obvious question. They never considered they would do that for JFK?
Well, he was buried there oh, you mean, no.
I mean, that's really an obvious no, that they did not.
No, they did not. The difference there, and your question kicks off a couple of snippets from the material I've gone through. One of the obvious differences is that you have a president versus a non-president, right? So the urgency with John was keener, and one of the whole elements of that process from his death to the funeral in D.C. was the concern in the Cold War establishment that the American security apparatus demonstrate its continuity and its strength. Supposedly, that's why Johnson took the oath of office on Air Force One, when in fact he didn't really legally need to do that. And so it's an interesting question. I don't think it's obvious at all. I think it's an excellent, good one. That was the way they kicked the difference around in the archives. There's one in back. Oh, you've already got a microphone.
Yep.
You probably brought that with you, didn't you?
I did. Fascinating presentation. When I'm thinking about the Lincoln train, obviously there was clearly an expectation that there would be people there to mourn along the tracks. I mean, you presented the schedule that shows even just from Cleveland down to Columbus. But I get the sense that this was a much more spontaneous, not expected, that people were surprised, or were they not?
Yes and no. One of the things was that the time was so compact, and they had so little time to prepare that they were really figuring things out on the fly. And you know, who do you call on the Penn Railroad to make sure that the tracks are clear on the northbound? I mean, how do you do that? Who does that, right? They had to figure that out right away. And now you figure, well, these are big shot people. They've got all kinds of connections. Shouldn't have been that hard. And it's clear that they were trying to get that kind of stuff done. Part of which was their concern, of course, that there were going to be a lot of people on the tracks, right? Because the thing is, if again, this is so apparent through the pictures, you got the train bearing down, you can have people up on the loading dock, right, the platform, but that means the other side is left completely open, and people in open areas can just walk on the tracks, right, even though that could be a northbound train. So it seems like there was some concern about it, but they just clearly didn't convey that effectively to the Penn Railroad people, who, as you know, as you can easily guess, everybody had excuses for why it happened. Why we didn't get it done. They were supposed to have a decoy train that was alerting people. There was some talk that some Penn people blamed the Secret Service helicopters that were hovering overhead and arguing that the people on the tracks in Elizabeth didn't hear the warning whistles because of the helicopters. I only have seen that once, so that claim wasn't confirmed. So it's the fog of war kind of thing. I'm sure that if they had more time and planning put into it, that wouldn't have happened. That's the best I can answer. Yes, sir.
I was just curious, that Bobby RFK Jr. leading the casket. Yeah.
No, that's Joe. That's Joe.
Joe.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Again, Glenn was responsible for choosing the pallbearers. But the list I've got from the Glenn papers is very different from this list. There's some that are recognizable. This is Steve Smith. This is David Hackett, who was Bobby's oldest and closest friend, a very close friend from high school days. That, of course, is McNamara. Siegenthaler was supposed to be in this, but he clearly isn't. Siegenthaler had a beautiful head of hair. Siegenthaler. You'd think a Steigerwald could pronounce the guy's name right, although it's constantly misspelled. And he's clearly not there. There's too many bald heads here. This is Rayford Johnson, who was there at the shooting, right? Was very close aide. He and Roosevelt Grier, another of the many different kinds of celebrities that were drawn to Kennedy. That train had, Lauren Bacall, Milton Berle and his wife, Jimmy Durante. What is Jimmy Durante doing? honest, Stoughton took a picture of Durandi, and I had to look at it, and because it's not identified. So that has to be him. And I did confirm that. So I'm not sure of all these guys yet, but it's clearly not the group that Glenn laid down. However, these three guys that's family right there. Doug Dillon is supposed to be in back. He was John's Treasury secretary, right? One or two other big shots were supposed to be in there. Yeah, you can tell he's a Kennedy. The hair. Yes, sir.
I want to ask you a question about your field, if I can, beyond just the material. Thanks. Beyond the material that you're espousing here, I'm sort of curious about how you figure out how to present the materials, because I'm sort of curious if it's bound up in sort of like a dragnet methodology, just the facts ma'am kind of thing, or if there's how you place your process and position with it. Because you talked a lot about, or you showed a lot of photographs, and as you know, Susan Sontag talks about, you know, in Plato's Cave article about how, you know, a photograph isn't truth. A photograph is, you know, shadows on the wall of truth. And so I'm sort of curious, how do you come to when you're gleaning information by someone's sort of biased writings or someone's photographs that you're interpreting? How does that enter into the material that you sort of present? Does that make sense?
Well, sure. I guess my thinking now about this material is that I don't want to overinterpret it, and I don't want to read into anything too much that I have no business reading into. You can't discern people's minds from these photos, right? So that seems to me to be something to handle with great care and with modest claims rather than any kind of imposition on them. And then another part of me just wants to say, well, this is what I see there. And I think that's legitimate too. It's something that I don't theorize a whole lot about because that makes my life easier. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so what's the presentation?
Thank you, Bill.
The question I have is how long in your mind would ideally it take before the book could come out?
Before the what?
The book could come out. Obviously, it's not going to be immediate.
No, let's aim for 60 years. Not 60 years from today, but the 60-year anniversary, which will be 28. I have in mind a really modest book here. So I'm thinking 175 pages, you know, something I should be able to knock out, I would hope, within that time. And, you know, coming away from the Kennedy at the end of this week, I feel pretty good about how much material I got through and how my thinking is moving along. So yeah, I think I can get down to writing pretty quickly. And this has been in my head for a long time, so yeah. So let's aim for that. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Yes, sir.
One of the big what-ifs, had Bobby been elected president, is the direction that the Vietnam War would have taken. You have any observations about that?
So he was trying to middle ground it, which was one of the things that took the McCarthy people off. You know, in his campaign speeches, he was saying, I'm not for a withdrawal, a precipitous withdrawal, but one of the key things that he was offering was the inclusion of representatives from the National Liberation Front in negotiations. That was a non-starter for Johnson and was one of the key reasons why the peace talks did not move along in '67 and '68. So that was a really big move on Bobby's part. You could read it in that way. So I'm guessing that's the way he would have moved as president, more cautiously than many people, including many of the young people supporting him, would have wanted, but nonetheless in a direction. He clearly would have dramatically decreased the bombing. I think that was the very first thing that they would have done. But that was kind of low-hanging fruit, actually, because the bombing was ineffective and so forth. But in any event, that's what I think he would have done. First stop the bombing and then broaden the peace talks.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Okay, great.
A fascinating presentation. As I look around, too, it looks like most of the people here were there in 1968, and I guess I look like I'm still there in 1968. That said, so, the parallels between 1968 and the present political moment that we're in, of course, this year we've had an attempted assassination on a presidential candidate. We've also had a sitting president who has said that he will not seek nor shall he accept his party's nomination for re-election. So when we think about your project with this book, what do you hope the audience or the reader will glean about the present political moment through this examination of what happened in 1968?
Yeah, I guess the key thing for me would be to think about the great polarizing schisms, of race, class. I didn't share with you the angle I think I'm going to take this. I have to talk to Mike Flamm a whole lot more about this before I do. But one of the things that has developed is what the great political scientist Ronald Inglehart calls post-material liberalism. Inglehart writes overwhelmingly about Europe and Western Europe, and American historians have not paid sufficient attention to him. But what he argues is that through the 60s, a certain strain of liberalism moved away from the sort of wages and hours, quantitative liberalism, to greater concern about rights, environment, quality of life issues. And one of the things that carries with it has been a decidedly different kind of class arrangement in our party structures than existed in 1960. And you can see that very clearly in income, education levels when you compare the Democratic Party now against the Republicans. What I'm going to suggest is that maybe that's what we should be looking at with Bobby Kennedy, rather than what would or wouldn't have happened had he lived. What effect did this dynamic that he established have for the development of post-material politics in the United States? I'm sure everybody's familiar with the concept of the backlash, which Richard Nixon, of course, played with great vigor. That is, getting working-class whites to vote against their economic interests on the basis of race and other claims like law and order, which, by the way, Bobby Kennedy kind of mastered as well. There's another side to that historians haven't really, that we have not yet really gone through systematically, and that's what I guess I'm going to call frontlash, where a certain sector of well-educated, well-to-do whites moved increasingly toward progressive politics in ways that didn't necessarily accord with their economic interests. And so maybe that's where this is going. Thanks for the question. It really helps. You've been a wonderful audience, and I'm sorry for holding you as long as I have. But everybody will tell you once Steigerwald gets going, you can't shut him up.
Well, thank you so much. And we hope when the book comes out that you do another book talk here.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a promise.